This screencast shows the final product of a project-based learning class at the University of Virginia taking place in the fall semester of 2017. The class got together to talk about 17th century Tibet, and we morphed into a different topic altogether in looking at cultural change in Tibet from olden times to the present. And we did this by looking through the lens of a artist, a contemporary Tibetan artist named Gunkar Gyatso. So it's basically divided into four segments. There are four panels in his artwork, My Identity. Traditional Tibet, Chinese Tibet, the Indian diaspora, and the world diaspora. So let's go through them one at a time. So the first one looks at this painting that that Gyatso did, talking about traditional Tibet, and there's some discussion here about the fact that this was based on a photograph in 1937 taken by Charles Cutting, one of the first Westerners to come into Tibet, and Gyatso took this photograph and replicated its pose throughout the four poses that he does in the future. So one of the things we want to look at was the Dalai Lamas themselves. There were 14 Dalai Lamas, and we wanted to talk about that they're all emanations of the Bodhisattva of compassion, who's Avalokiteshvara. I never pronounced that right. And so we could look at some information about that Bodhisattva, and then talk about the third Dalai Lama, who's actually the first named Dalai Lama. He went back and identified the other two before. The Great Fifth was an important Dalai Lama back in the 17th century. And of course, we have to talk about the 14th, who is the current Dalai Lama, and there's some discussion of him. Each of the other Dalai Lamas have things about them, but since they didn't have as much of an impact as the other ones, we basically gave just a paragraph on each one. And very importantly also is the fact that there may or may not be another Dalai Lama, because the 14th Dalai Lama hasn't decided whether to reincarnate and make a new one based on some of the issues that are going on in Tibet, in China, I'm sorry. Okay, so art is an important aspect of Tibetan culture, and so this dot looks at a variety of different ways the art has been done. Traditional, and some videos that talk about various aspects. Festivals are an important portion of Tibet, and this panel talks about those festivals using photographs and things from them. And the environment of Tibet is critical. So to understanding the way Tibetans live, and so this panel looks at various things about it, and about the environment, animals that are native to Tibet, and of course plants. Okay, the second panel looks at the relationship between China and Tibet after the Chinese invasion and occupation of Tibet in 1950. So this first one looks at the occupation itself. And so one of the things that happened is after the occupation, there were, before the occupation, there were about 6,000 Buddhist temples throughout Tibet, of which there are only a handful now that have been rebuilt. So this is a map showing where all the temples were before, and not too many of them are left at this point. And then there's some discussion about the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution. So I think there's some graphs you can look at, and the destruction of the monasteries. Okay, and communist control is an interesting one because this student chose to look at the self-immolations, where monks and lay people would set themselves on fire. This map shows where these occurred throughout Tibet. The biggest one was Aba County, and she went and digitized all the information about each particular self-immolation. So on February 27th, this was the first one that was recorded. At the Kirti Monastery, a monk, 24-year-old monk, set himself on fire. And if you go through, you can see all the other ones that were in there. And there's some discussion about it. This chart shows how these things happen over time. So there weren't too many happening up until it started really pick up in 2010, reached its apex at 2012, and you can see where in what counties they took place, and started to die down shortly thereafter. It was mainly men, but there was a fair number of women actually self-immolated too, and it looks like more or less 50-50 monks and lay people. And she talks about the Dalai Lama's reaction to that. There's some discussion here about the Dalai Lama himself, the 14th Dalai Lama, and then talk about Tibet today and how how the things like the railroad and other kinds of access to Lhasa itself has changed it, and the influction of Han Chinese into Tibet has diluted the population, and tourism has become a big deal. Chinese tourists are somewhat disrespectful or often disrespectful to traditional Tibetan cultures, as evidenced by some of these photographs. All right, the third panel looks at the Indian diaspora, and this is where Tibetans initially fled towards India, starting in 1950. So if we look at the actual demography, we can see where they went. The bulk of them seem to have gone to this place, Karnataka, but they went all throughout India, Delhi, and a large population in Dharamsala, where they ultimately set up a government in exile. And that government in exile was set up by the Dalai Lama in 1959 when he fled, and it became a seat of the Tibetan government throughout the world, of the Tibetan exile government. This chart shows some of the way that the government was organized. Okay, and the Dalai Lama itself. This panel looks at the fleeing of the Dalai Lama from Lhasa, ultimately to Dharamsala, and she tracked where they went. So if we click here, we can see where the Dalai Lama went, and over time. And finally, there's some discussion of education and culture there. So these are the Tibetan temples and monasteries in India, the schools in India, and some videos discussing that in higher education, also the preservation taken by a person to collect the Tibetan writings that were lost over time, and they sit now into this. If we click on this, this will bring up a website that shows where they are with the video in it. Okay, our final panel is looking at the global diaspora, the world diaspora, where Tibetans' relationship with the world. And so again, we look at the demography of it. We can see that the bulk of the people went to India, but they're fairly spread out through the world. And by clicking on it, we can see how many people went and in any given place, and that then we go to the Western interactions. This is a little bit more detailed about what people did about the Tibetan diaspora interacting with the rest of the world. So by clicking on various these stars, we can bring up. So many people went to Switzerland, and so there's quite a lot of discussion about that. Canada was also a big place where people went, in Toronto, etc. And surprisingly, and to the point of us in Charlottesville, there's a large Tibetan population in Charlottesville itself, and so there's some discussion of that. Now, when talking about the Dalai Lama here, what the thing that is highlighted is the Kalachakra festivals, which is a ceremony in Tibet that the Dalai Lama, or in Tibetan Buddhism, that the Dalai Lama officiates all over the world. And so there are a variety of different ones, and this shows where these Kalachakra festivals took place and how many people there. So 100,000 people in India in that one. Looks like there was one in New York, 30,000. So these are fairly large events. And of course, one at some point has to discuss the fact that he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And this is a video of his acceptance at the there. Finally, Global Tibet looks at the final picture of the series. I had said before there are only 4 pictures in the series. There's a 5th that he did in 2012, that Gonkar Gyatso did in 2012, that sums up his place in the world today. And so there's discussion about that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and you can check out the actual visualization by going to this website and see it live and look through it.